with me once again to the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans. You'll find it on page 1194 if you're using a Pew Bible. And this is now our third study in this magnificent letter. And we come to a very important opening words of the introduction, particularly verses 16 and 17. So let's hear God's word. If you're able to stand, would you please do so in reverence, for it is the word of our God. Let's back up to verse 14, where Paul says, I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Here's the word of our God. Blessed are those who hear and who embrace it by faith. You may be seated. Paul, in these opening words to this magnificent letter, identifies himself as a servant and as an apostle, a sent out one by Christ, and one that has been set apart by God, particularly for the gospel of Christ. And so Paul understood his marching orders. And he understood that he was a man under obligation. He was conscious of the calling that God had called him to. And that's why he was eager to make his way to Rome. There was a huge community there, of course, as Rome was a significant city. And he was desirous to bring the gospel into the very heart of the Roman Empire. And to be with the Christians there in the heart of Rome. He had made several attempts over the years, but as he tells us, those attempts were hindered in one way or another. But he does desire to make his way there sometime in the future. But in the providence of God, to this point, he has to write a letter to them, probably from Corinth. And in God's providence, we have this letter. I've often thought, as a study through Paul's epistle, and coming back to these words I meant to come to you, if he probably did make his way in God's providence to them earlier, we probably wouldn't have this letter. And so, God's ways, God's wisdom, and here we are, and it's a wonderful letter. But so he makes that desire known to them, that he wanted to go there, and he still plans, if it's God's will, a great way to pray for something that we desire greatly. It creates a contentment in our hearts. If it happens, well, that's wonderful, but if it doesn't, then we're also content with that. But now he shows to them, or he demonstrates to them at the end of this opening greetings, this introduction, a number of theme statements. Statements that he'll elaborate on throughout the rest of the letter. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, Jews and Greeks. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And so here are themes, and if you're at all familiar with this letter, you will notice, these words, these themes, these phrases will come up again and again. The gospel, well, we've heard a lot of it already, and we're just starting the letter. The power of God here in the gospel. The righteousness of God revealed That's a huge statement, and that will become increasingly important in the next number of verses. And then the whole issue of faith. Faith will become very, very important as we move on. And so these great themes, Paul just gives them to us here in very succinctly. It's the way they used to write in Paul's days. Their introduction was very brief in that sense and often contained just the bare minimum so that the readers might come to recognize, okay, this is what Paul is going to be eventually speaking about. And that's what we'll be thinking about as well in the days to come. So as we come to the end of this introduction to this letter, I'd like for us to think of some of these themes just generally so we can get our bearings for where Paul is going. There are four things I'd like to think about: the saving power of the gospel, the extent of the gospel, the character of God revealed in the gospel, and the reception of the gospel. So the saving power of God. In verse 14, Paul reminds us that he's a man under obligation, a man under authority. In verse 15, we noted that this sense of obligation, this sense of calling to this particular task of bringing the gospel, gave him an eagerness to preach the gospel. And now notice in verse 16, he tells us he's not ashamed of the gospel. So he gives us three strong personal statements. I'm under obligation, verse 14. I'm eager, verse 15. And now verse 16, I'm not afraid, or I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Now, it's interesting, when you think of that statement, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, it's evident that apparently some were ashamed of the gospel. A statement like this doesn't just pop up anywhere and for no reason. Obviously, there were sections or groups within the community that Paul was writing to that were ashamed, embarrassed of the gospel. You know, Paul hadn't yet made his way to Rome, but the gospel that Paul preached made its way to Rome, and so they identified that with Paul's gospel. As Paul will say at the end in chapter 16, my gospel, not that it's originated with him, but the gospel he preached. He was the preacher to the Gentiles of this gospel. And so apparently it had made its way there, and people were not pleased with it. They mocked it. Matter of fact, chapter 3, verse 7 and 8 will bring some of this to light. They were critical about Paul and his message. So Paul felt the necessity to come to the gospel's defense. And he says, listen, I'm not ashamed of this gospel. Now, there are reasons, of course, why one might be reluctant to be ashamed of the gospel and to communicate the gospel, especially in Rome. As I mentioned last week, Rome was Rome. Rome was the city. There was no city like Rome. It was a symbol of imperial pride and power. People stood in awe of Rome. Say Rome, and people would say, you know, I can't wait to get there. They made it their ambition, many, to visit Rome at least once in their lifetime. And so Rome was the eternal city that brought peace to the world. It was the center of commerce and culture and every new religion, a home for every kind of idolatrous worship. It was a significant city, and the ruler of Rome was Caesar. So a bit intimidating, do you think, to call yourself a Christian? And Paul understood as well that the gospel itself, the message of the cross, was foolishness, as he says later to the Corinthians. It was foolishness to some and a stumbling block for others. Foolishness to the Greeks, to the elites, to the philosophers. And here he's in Rome. He understands the foolishness of the cross of Christ, the message of the cross of Christ, and a stumbling block for some Jews. He recognizes that. He's not naive. He knew that when the gospel goes forth, or to identify somehow with the gospel, it will bring opposition and ridicule, mockery, and hostility. Paul was aware of this. You know, he even, when he went to the Corinthians, he says, you know, I'm coming to you with this gospel, with the message of the cross. And he says, I'm coming in weakness, in fear, and much trembling. This is the Apostle Paul. So I'm suggesting Paul knows the reasons why one might be reluctant to embrace the gospel and to publicize the gospel. And yet Paul says he is not ashamed of the gospel. He's not ashamed of it. And you know, neither should we be. And neither should the Romans. That's what he's trying to say at the beginning. And hopefully by the end, everybody will conclude, why are we ashamed? Why should we be ashamed of the gospel? You know, the reasons, I think, the primary reason for being ashamed of the gospel is because of the fear of being persecuted for the gospel. There's always that fear of suffering. You know, it's there. You would gladly identify with something if it brought you fame and glory and so forth. But identifying with the gospel, there's that fear of persecution and being felt or being the subject of ridicule. You know, you're at school. You went to church on Sunday. What did the preacher teach you about? You know, prosperity theology? No, it was a theology of the cross. The cross? You believe in the cross? Yeah. You see, it doesn't get much traction, does it? And you feel it, don't you? I feel it. I'm a preacher. I feel it. I sense it. I understand what Paul is saying, fear and trembling. Because the gospel does create this hostility and animosity. It's not welcomed. Every other religion is welcome, but not the Christian religion. And so there is reason to be ashamed of it from a human perspective. You know, it jeopardizes our status among peers and maybe even promotion for our work environment. It has all of these ramifications that for a watching world is devastating. The gospel is not popular. It never was. And Paul understands it, and we, I think, understand it to a certain degree as well. And I think if we were honest with ourselves, many of us would have to confess that we are ashamed at times of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's demonstrated, not so much, it's not like we say to each other verbally, I'm really ashamed of this. No, but it's demonstrated in our lives. We're willing and eager, in fact, to speak about so many things. But not so much of the gospel. Maybe among Christians, but certainly not among non-Christians, the world. And so it's in our lack of enthusiasm, our lack of eagerness to communicate, that our embarrassment of it often can be seen. Well, not for Paul. You know, he's eager. He's eager to preach the gospel to those in Rome, verse 15. And he's not ashamed of this gospel. And here it is. Why? Why is Paul not ashamed? He gives the answer there in verse 15. Because, he says, it is the power of God for salvation to all who believe. Isn't that remarkable? It's the power of God to salvation to all who believe. You know, Rome symbolized the power of the world in Paul's day. And yet over and against this earthly power, another power has been unleashed on the world. And that's what Paul is not ashamed of, the power of God to salvation. You see, this is why Paul's not ashamed. The power of Rome was embraced and able to subdue the nations and to bring them under the Roman authority, but only for a time, and only under this peace that was superficial. But Paul understood that the power of God, unlike the power of Rome, is able to subdue men and women, boys and girls from all nations and bring them under the lordship of Jesus Christ for time and for eternity. That's what we rejoice in when we think about the death of Miles. Christ's work, Christ's authority, subduing Miles to himself, keeping him, and then keeping him for all of eternity. You see, and not only that authority subduing us by himself, but granting us peace. Rome's peace was superficial, and where's Rome now? You see, and that's why Paul considered the gospel of Jesus Christ something not to be ashamed of. Paul saw that beyond the petty temporal powers of the Roman Empire stood the mighty power of God to save. That's what was the preoccupation of his mind. You know, Paul had clear vision. And that's what we see here. Paul understood all of what life was in a fallen world, but he understood that over and above all these things, what wasn't visible to the natural eye, but only to the eye of faith, was this power, a power that could do for people and for nations what no other power could possibly do. And that's what he glories in. A power that can bring salvation, a power that is all-encompassing, an inheritance which will never fade away. You know, this word salvation, we often think of it very isolated as in terms of our conversion, but we should think, especially in an introduction like this, salvation that encompasses the whole of our salvation, not just us as individuals, but the salvation of from beginning to end, and the new heavens and the new earth, the consummation. And so Paul is saying, this is why I glory in this gospel, and this is why I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God to salvation. So is it any wonder then why he's not ashamed of this marvelous gospel? And you know, when we think about the gospel in this way, that it is powerful to save, that it is a salvation for all of eternity, that it is all-encompassing, then, you know, what is there to be ashamed of? Don't you often think about that sometimes when you are ashamed of it, and you just sit back at a quiet moment and you say, now why was I ashamed? Now, why didn't I speak about Christ to this person? I had the opportunity. You see, when we think of it in light of how Paul saw things, it doesn't make sense to be ashamed of the gospel, does it? It's the power of God to salvation. Is there anything like it in this world? And it's to salvation. It's a peace with God. For crying out loud. Why would we be ashamed of it? Could it possibly be because we just haven't digested, appreciated what the gospel is? Well, Paul's not ashamed of it. And he doesn't want the Romans to be ashamed of it. And we shouldn't be ashamed of it either, because it is the saving power of God. Secondly, then, the extent of the gospel. Saving power of the gospel, extent of the gospel. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of it, for it is the power of God's salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. So the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So the gospel is for everyone. And Paul, you remember, is the preacher to the gospel, to the Gentiles. And his great ambition was to make the gospel known to all the Gentiles, not where Christ, as he says in chapter 50, not where Christ had already been named, but to those places where they have not yet heard of Christ. And so Paul is very conscious of this, that this gospel is for the whole world. It's for everyone, Jew and Gentile. And that's a theme that resounds throughout his whole letter. But it does seem that there is a priority here. Paul says to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Now, does that mean it is primarily for the Jew and then also to Greek? No, because God is he's not partial. Paul writes this way because there is a historical precedent here. Going all the way back to Abram, and he will be a main figure in Paul's discussion later on, but going all the way back, God chose to focus the salvation of all the nations through the one nation, Israel. You see? And so when God chose Abraham, he chose Abraham as the father of the Jewish nation, so that in Abraham and through that nation, all the nations of the world would be blessed. And so there is a promise that was given to the Jews first, blessing to the nations through the Jews, so that the Greeks, which Paul refers to here as all the Gentiles, everybody who's not of Abrahamic descent, so that the Greeks might also know the gospel. But it came through the Jewish nation. That's what Paul's saying. It's something like Jesus said to the Samaritan woman when he said, don't you know that salvation is of the Jews? Right? It's that same thing. God has revealed himself to Abram, to Israel, and then through the Jewish nation to all the people. And that was also Paul's custom when he, as we see in the book of Acts, when he came to various cities. He would always try to find a synagogue first, or the Jews, preach the gospel to them, and then carry on to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And in a sense, this is the movement of the gospel. Even Jesus, before he ascended on high in Acts chapter 1, he said to the disciples, stay here in Jerusalem until the Spirit comes, and so you can bring the gospel to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And so first to the Jews, and then to the Gentiles. It had to go to the ends of the earth. And that's what Paul is bringing in focus here. The gospel is for all people. The good news, the way of salvation, is for all people, all nations. There's not a different message for one society or one group of people or one culture than another. No, there is just one. Now, perhaps there is another dimension here that Paul just slightly hints at when he says first the Jew and also to the Greek, which I know he'll elaborate on in chapters 9 through 11. There is this priority of the Jews, not merely from a historical reality, but in fact crucial to the outworking of salvation. Remember, Paul will talk about this fact that through the rejection of the gospel by the Jews, the gospel has come to the Gentiles. So the Jewish nation, in rejecting it, it's in that way, in their rejection of the gospel, it actually has come and transmitted to the Jews. Perhaps that's also hinted at here. But clearly, the gospel is for everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, without discrimination, without partiality, without limitation. There is only one salvation for Jew and for Gentile. So, the saving purpose of the gospel, the extent of the gospel. And then notice, thirdly, the revelation of God in the gospel. Because as you read these verses, you're probably asking yourself, how is the gospel the saving power of God? He just made a statement. It is. And now we're asking, how is it? What is it about the gospel that is the power of God to salvation? Well, Paul gives that answer to us, for us, in verse 17. Now, notice once again how the verse opens with that little word, for. For in it, Paul says, in what? In the gospel, he's speaking about the gospel, in it, in the gospel, something is revealed. Now let's just stop there for a moment. And I say stop there for a moment because that word revealed has been overlooked in a lot of our studies on the book of Romans. It's almost been eclipsed in a lot of scholarship and even in commentaries. We go from righteousness of God to the phrase faith by faith, and the word revealed doesn't even seem to be that important. But Paul is saying the gospel is the power of God unto salvation because of what is revealed in it. The theme of revelation is actually very, very important for the Apostle Paul. Not only to understand this verse and the context, but to understand the following verses, 18 through 32, and in fact all the way to chapter 3. There's this theme, the subject of revelation is very important in the opening 3 chapters of Paul's book. And we know this subject of revelation is important because he goes on to speak about it. You know, verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed. And then in verse 19, and notice how he goes on to say, what can be known of God is plain to them because God has shown it to them or made it known, revealed it to them. In verse 20, Paul describes the invisible things of God, namely his eternal power and divine nature, having been clearly perceived or made known ever since the creation of the world. So 4 times in 4 verses, Paul has specified 4 statements about the revelation of God. The revelation of God. Obviously, this repetition signifies just how important the subject of revelation is to Paul's argument. And hopefully we'll see this in the next number of weeks. But coming back now to verse 17, which is the first instance where Paul uses this word revelation, he says that something is revealed in the gospel. So what is it that is revealed in the gospel? And the answer is the righteousness of God. The righteousness of God. The gospel is the saving power of God for salvation to all who believe, because in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. The righteousness of God is revealed. So the gospel is the power of God, Paul says. It's the power of God because it reveals something about God. Do you see? It's the power of God because it reveals something about God. What does the gospel reveal? Well, the gospel makes visible something that otherwise would be invisible. Or to state it in the other way around. The things about God that are invisible, because God is a spirit, God is invisible. So the things about God that are invisible are made visible through God's revelation. Otherwise, we won't see it if God had not revealed it. And Paul's making this grand statement at the beginning of his letter that God has revealed something. Now, when we hear that, we ought to be jumping off our chairs, but we're Presbyterians, so we're just going to sit right there. But you see, the point that I'm trying to make, this is something significant. God's revealing something. What is he revealing? Well, Paul says, his righteousness, the righteousness of God. Now, what does that mean when Paul says the righteousness of God? Well, it's an attribute of God. He is the righteous one. So when Paul speaks of the righteousness of God here, he's communicating something about God's being, who he is, and that he's absolutely consistent with his character. That there's no shadow of difference with him. He's consistent. He is faithful to who he is. He never deviates from who he is as God. We often think of God in general ways, but it would be a great study to think of the attributes of God. And I've got a few books to help you if you want to do that. It's amazing. Just think of the different aspects of God, his character, his attributes, his being. So he's the faithful one. God acts in accordance to what is right. And he himself is the standard of what is right. And so, Moses, for instance, will speak about God in this way. In Deuteronomy 32, all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity. Just and right is he. And you remember Abraham when he was pleading with God for Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember at the end of all of his pleads, he appeals to God's righteous character. He says, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Now, Paul is saying that the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. He's speaking about the character of God. He describes a quality or an attribute of God's righteousness, of who he is. So that phrase, the righteousness of God, that we find in verse 17, is not his saving righteousness that he gives to people or imputes to believers. That's often how it has been understood, and traditionally in our Reformed circles, a righteousness received from God and given to a believer, a righteousness that is imputed to sinners. Now, that truth, that reality, that doctrine, that teaching is absolutely biblical, and Paul will speak about it. But he doesn't speak about it here. That's the point. A lot of times as preachers, we can preach things that are true, but they're not true from this passage. We preach doctrinally, so we kind of pull a word here and there, and then we preach the doctrine on that word when it doesn't really have a bearing, a foundation in that text that we're preaching. Thank God that he has mercy upon us. But this is how the text has been preached, and this is how I preached it over the years. And I've been... Through my studies, I found this wonderful relatively new study on Paul's letter, and it happens to be one of the former professors of Christian, who's done such a tremendous work on this job, and it's very, very, very thorough in his study, but he makes this point very clear. It's not the righteousness that God gives to somebody. It's his character that is at stake right here and in this chapter 1, verse 17. Paul is teaching that the phrase, the righteousness of God, is something about God himself displayed in the gospel of God. Now, we know that the gospel, it was, as Paul defined it in verse 2 and 3, is about about God's Son, isn't it? It's about how he was descended from David according to the flesh and declared to be the Son of God in power. So the person and the work of God. But notice, this is interesting. The gospel, it reveals something about God himself. And in the opening verse, we discover that Paul calls it the gospel of God. Isn't that interesting? Not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, not the gospel of salvation, but the gospel of God. God is there prominent. And as I'll show you here in a few minutes, if we have time, that the theocentricity, the focus of God, more than even Jesus Christ, is what's prominent in these opening verses to this gospel. And so it's this gospel of God that God has already beforehand promised in the Gospels, and now in time has come about in Jesus Christ. Do you see? And so in this gospel coming to fruition in Jesus Christ, God is shown to be faithful, to be righteous, to be altogether truthful, to be a God of integrity. What he said has come to pass. He is faithful to the covenant. And you know, as we study from Genesis, he's pledged himself to his people to be faithful to the covenant. You see, he's a covenant-keeping God. And in the gospel, that aspect, that character of God is made abundantly clear in the coming, in the fullness of time, in the gospel. Now, notice the connection that Paul is making here between verse 16 and 17. Paul is not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation, for in it, in the gospel, something is revealed. What is revealed? The righteous character of God. So the way that God's righteousness is revealed in the gospel proves that the gospel itself is, in fact, the power of God unto salvation. You see, Paul is not just interested in the dimensions of our salvation. Of course that's important. He just spoke about in verse 16, the power of God for salvation. So it's not like he's not interested at all. Of course he is. He's a minister of the gospel. But it's broader than that. And it's greater than that. And it's deeper than that. Paul wants to draw our attention to the unique character of God, not just as he offers salvation, but in the one who offers salvation. Do you see? So Paul puts our focus not just exclusively on our salvation, what God has done for me. No, Paul, as it were, turns it upside down. He says the salvation that you have received ought to direct you to the God who gives it to you. So the focus is on God, on God's character. That's the point that I'm trying to say. And if you go through, you'll have to do this on your own, but if you go through verses 1 through 16, you'll see how the emphasis often is on God, the gospel of God, which God promised. And it's concerning his son. Whose son? God's son. Do you see that? It's the power of God, verse 16. It's the righteousness of God. And then in verse 8, it's love, or verse 7, the Romans are loved by God. Verse 8, Paul thanks God for, and on and on and on. There's more references to God than to Jesus Christ. That's Paul wants to extol, to magnify the God who is over all and the God who has given us salvation. You know, I was just thinking in my study of the different examples in the book of Romans, and think of when he brings Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a huge figure in history, isn't he? In history books, and a powerful figure. So Rome, powerful in Paul's day. Pharaoh, powerful in Israel's day, obviously. He brings up the subject of Pharaoh. What does he say? Yeah, this is the guy that, did all of this to God's people and I brought salvation. No. When the subject of Pharaoh comes up, Paul brings the focus on God's glory. He says, for this reason, I've raised Pharaoh up, so that I might manifest my glory. Do you see? The focus is again on God, on the one who gives salvation. And when you think about it, you'll just read Romans and you'll see with this new lens that it's all about the greatness of this God. And I love how after Paul has been, elaborated on the goodness of God and the salvation that he gives, look how he concludes. Oh, the depths of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable are his ways. For from him and through him and to him be all things. To him be the glory forever. Do you see? Where's the focus? Every phrase, his riches, his wisdom, his knowledge, his judgment, his ways, express the same interest in God himself and his character as is underscored here in chapter 1, verse 17. Paul's focus is on God, who is, and what is otherwise invisible about God, now made visible in the things that God has revealed. And so already in the opening statement, then, Paul wishes to underscore that in the gospel, promised previously through the prophets, now accomplished in his Son, God's own righteousness is made known. So the saving power of the gospel, the extent of the gospel, the character of God revealed in the gospel, and then finally the reception of the gospel. Well, Paul communicates this in verse 17. He says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed. And then he says, from faith to faith. From faith to faith. Now, there is probably no phrase in the whole letter of Romans that has been given such widely divergent interpretations as this phrase, from faith to faith. Is it the faith of the Old Testament saints to now the faith of the New Testament saints? Or is it growth in faith, from faith to faith? I mean, there are so many different renderings of this text. So how ought we to understand that phrase? Well, first, it's important to recognize that this phrase describes the word revealed, and not the word righteousness, as has often been the case historically. So when this phrase is studied in connection with the word revealed, so the righteousness of God is revealed from faith through faith, we discover that that phrase, from faith to faith, refers to the source of the revelation and to the destination of that revelation. The source and the destination. So the phrase from faith to faith describes how the righteousness of God is revealed from the source, from God's faith, or we can say God's faithfulness, to the destination, to our faith. Do you see? Does that make sense? So it's God. And that's the point, the whole idea of revelation. But I've been trying to labor the point. If God doesn't reveal, then we will not know. That's why Paul's emphasis in these early chapters is the invisible realities of God are made known. Why? Because God's revealed them. And so now, in light of that key word, reveal, it is God who reveals something. So origin to destination. That's how we have to understand these words. And when we think about it in light of, all of our theology, and certainly Romans, it makes a pure good sense. It's God who reveals this to his people. It's all of God. And again, going back to verse 1, it's the gospel of God and gospel of God's Son. It's God who does this for us, you see. So it's God's faithfulness that is highlighted in that opening word, from faith. He is the source, and he gives it to us. So verse 17 then describes how God is directing or revealing something about himself to us. So it comes to us through faith. So faith is the way of life. And as we'll go on in our study of Romans, faith is essential. It's the way of salvation. There is no other way of salvation than by faith. Faith is critical. Faith is important. You know, there's only one way of salvation, and it's by believing the gospel, verse 16. And ultimately, it's faith in Jesus Christ. Now, it's not until chapter 3 that Paul returns to that theme of the righteousness of God, that it comes about not through the visible expression of power and glory like the nations would see it, but through the bloody atoning death of Jesus Christ at the cross. You see, he'll speak about that at the end of chapter 3. It's through the giving of God's Son, ultimately, that we might be reconciled to him. But the point that Paul's wanting to make, in order to see the power of God in the cross of God, you need faith. You need eyes of faith. Do you see? There were so many people who saw Christ on the cross in Palestine. And they saw him like any other man hanging on the cross. And it was just like people like the centurion who can come by grace because God's revealed it to him and open his eyes and says, wow, that's the Son of God there. How did he know he was the Son of God? Because faith was granted to him by God. His eyes were open to see it. That's the point. And Paul will make that clear as we move on, but I want you to understand it now. It's by faith that we grasp the realities, that we see the invisible things clearly. Faith in Jesus Christ. Not weakness, but power in the cross of Christ. Now look at this. This is wonderful. I have to stop here soon, but let's a few more minutes. There is one way of salvation taught in the scriptures from beginning to end. Remember, Paul starts off, he says, the gospel of God promised beforehand in the prophets. So he's going way back to the Old Testament. The gospel of God, way back. Now look what he says. He says this salvation that you need to believe is by faith. And he says, look what he does. He goes to the end, to the Old Testament scriptures, to Habakkuk chapter 2, where it says, as it is written. So he's proving this. This faith that you need to grasp in the new covenant is the same faith that they grasped in the old covenant. Do you see? The gospel that was declared beforehand in the prophets, it's the same gospel that I'm declaring. This is not a new thing. This is the way it's always been. There is one gospel of Jesus Christ from beginning to end, and the way that we receive Christ, or the way that we are saved in the old covenant and the new covenant, is by faith. And so that's why he ends now with this quotation from Habakkuk, the righteous, as it is written. As it is written, this is confirmed. Where? In the Holy Scriptures, which are the Word of God. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And so do you see how he's tying this all up together? It's magnificent. One faith for all time, believing in the gospel of Jesus Christ, experiencing the gospel power is always by faith, verse 16, and it always has been by faith. And so the quote from Habakkuk not only supports Paul's comment that the only way of salvation is by faith, but it also acts as a wonderful inclusio, do you see, to his introduction. The gospel of God, verse 1, the gospel. I'm not ashamed of this gospel, for in it, the gospel. Verse 16 and 17, prophesied beforehand, promised beforehand in the prophets. Now he quotes one of the prophets. You see how he ties it all together. He puts the ribbon on it. What I'm giving to you, Romans, is not a novelty. It is the fulfillment of who what God has promised, and it demonstrates his righteousness. Wow, what a great gospel. Do you see now why Paul's not ashamed of the gospel? This is magnificent. This takes us all the way back to the beginning, to the garden when man blew it. He says, this is it. This is the power of God unto salvation for everybody. That's why I want to come see you, and then after seeing you, I want to go on to Spain. How about that? Because there's nothing like this. The power of Rome is nothing compared to this. Not only is he not ashamed, he's eager. Oh, and might that also be true of us? Not ashamed, but eager to communicate the gospel power unto salvation. Let's pray. From you, and to you, and through you, and to you, be all glory, now and through the church forevermore. Amen. Let's respond by turning in our hymn books to section 141. 141, God in the gospel of his Son. Let's stand as we sing.